So I'm going to be talking about detecting publication bias and a few of the challenges that we've faced when trying to detect publication bias in the literature. I'm sure I'm probably preaching to the choir here, but I'll go through a brief sort of background to publication bias. So I looked at what Wikipedia said about it. And Wikipedia calls publication bias occurs when the outcome of an experiment or research study influences the decision whether to publish or otherwise distribute it. So great, that's quite a nice sort of definition. And it really gets at this sort of bias against negative results that we often see when we think about publication bias. But actually thinking about it, maybe that's not what publication bias is. You have things like bias against replication studies, status quo bias, biased against maybe uninteresting results, which all might be quite bad. And maybe we have a bias against scientifically unsound interpretations, which might be quite good. So there's lots of different forms that publication bias can come in. But we're really going to focus on this kind of bias against negative results at the moment. And the problem with having a bias against negative results, or bias with publication bias in general, is that we start to build our scientific theories on a biased subset of all possible information. And this is really bizarre, right? Because it's possibly one of the most unscientific things to be doing, to be knowingly building our theories on a biased subset of all the information that's been gathered beforehand. And not only that, but scientists seem to reinforce this system of having a particularly biased set of research that we cite all the time and we derive our theories from. And this is a problem because it makes it very difficult to judge the strength of evidence contained in a literature if you don't know all the studies that go on. And then if you want to look at the statistical side of it, then you see that published effect sizes are often quite largely overestimated because you have this statistical significance filter. So only or more studies that overestimate effect size are going to be published than studies that underestimate effect size. If it overestimates the size of an effect, you're more likely to get a p-value of less than 0.05. So publication bias is this really big problem. So we might want to have a go at detecting it. And I'm going to run through a few different methods which people have used to try and detect, okay, well, is publication bias a problem in my area or not? The first one is to identify the causes of this. And you can do this just by kind of looking at journal policies. So looking at, okay, well, do journals explicitly state we don't accept replication studies, we're only into novel and groundbreaking research? You can do surveys of editors and reviewers and ask them, okay, well, what's your opinion on negative results? And you might find that some of them are saying, okay, well, we don't like negative results. And you can also ask the authors, okay, well, do you submit all of your findings or do you just submit the positive ones and do you exclude negative results? And I'm sure a lot of you will know some of this research that I've cited up there. And this is good because it finds the source of the bias. You can get to, okay, well, when people are making the decision to accept a paper or submit a paper, where is this bias creeping in? But it doesn't really give us that much information about individual cases. It's kind of detached from the actual literature, and it might not generalize that well. It's kind of a little bit shaky that often if we're looking at editor and reviewer bias, we're getting these two citations from the early 90s coming out. So maybe we want to be a little bit cautious about how we interpret some of these results. The second thing to do is just to try and access the unpublished material. Go and look at conference proceedings and PhD theses and see if you can find negative results in there that haven't yet made it into the literature. A lot of people doing meta-analysis might email around some of the big research groups and say, do you have any unpublished data on this? And that's what they did in 2015, De Bruyn et al. They looked at conference papers that supported versus challenged the idea of a bilingual advantage in executive functioning, and they found that papers that were supporting positive conference papers were much, much more likely to end up being published than the negative ones. And this is quite good because it gives us information at the individual study level. You can follow individual studies and see which ones are getting published and which ones aren't. But it's quite an intensive method and you need lots of contacts. It's quite difficult for a researcher to say, I want to go and try and find all the unpublished literature about X. So that's also, okay, it's a nice method if you've got the time and if you have the resources, but it might not be that easy for many people to do. This should be number 3, but one of the most popular things to do is to look at data distributions, to generate P curves, Z curves, funnel plots, and look at the distribution of test statistics and see, okay, well, are there, and you can see this on the right-hand side, are there more p-values sort of floating around the 0.03, 0.04, 0.05 that we'd expect than if real effects were being studied? So you can see the green line traces out the distribution of p-values you'd expect if there was a real effect and it was being studied with 33% power. And this is really good because it gives us quantifiable information about a group of studies. And it's quite straightforward to run once you've collected the data from the literature. But on the negative side, these sorts of methods, they really try and reduce papers down to p-values and to statistics. And often the claims that are being made in papers aren't necessarily very easy to relate down to exactly, okay, well, this p-value is what this claim rests on. So there's a bit of a disconnect between the claims of the papers and the p-values that you're collecting or the test statistics you're collecting. And there's lots of assumptions that need to be met here. You want your data to be independent to run p-curves and z-curves, which might not be met if you have the same research groups publishing papers in similar ways. So there are limitations to these methods as well. And the final method, and I think this is the most cited one, is just to count out the prevalence of positive results. You might have heard the claim that psychology papers contain over 90% positive results, and contrast this with registered reports where you're getting perhaps under 50%. Okay, that's a big problem. If our literatures are only containing positive results, then either we're just running studies where the answers are already obvious, or there's this big wad of unpublished findings that we're not being able to see. But there are problems with this method as well, because these two papers, the highly cited Finelli one, just searched for papers containing the phrase test the hypothesis. Now, not all papers contain the phrase test the hypothesis, and you might get different selection biases coming in here. So people might be more likely to say test the hypothesis if they then confirm the hypothesis later on. So these findings might also be biased in themselves. I mean, it's straightforward and clear, but again, we're getting this reducing the papers to the significance test or the hypothesis tests, and there are quite large sampling biases. So we wanted to have a go at detecting publication bias in our field, in comparative cognition. Now, this is a small research field, and we have lots of non-independents, lots of similar groups publishing research with very similar methods and similar statistical tests. So the more quantifiable p-curve analyses and p-value distributions weren't really available to us. And it was also, we found it quite hard to reduce papers just to p-values and single significance tests. It often found that the papers were a little bit more complicated than this. But these challenges kind of gave us an opportunity, because publication bias does happen at the level of the paper. It doesn't happen at the level of the individual statistical test necessarily. So I'm going to talk you through the way that we tried to deal with this. So we got 63 papers for a keyword search, and we identified what we thought the main claim of this paper was. So from the abstract, we took out a sentence and we said, what is this paper really claiming? And we got an 89% agreement on this. So it was relatively straightforward to identify what the papers were claiming. And then we got 6 coders, 6 individuals, to categorize each claim according to 3 criteria. So we wanted to split the claims up into whether they were positive, negative, or kind of in the middle or inconclusive. So these positive claims were saying that an animal has a certain cognitive ability, it's able to pass a test, or anything that was kind of good about the animals, anything saying these animals are smart, they understand physical cognition. Negative claims, we're going to be saying, okay, well, the animals failed the test, they were a little bit dumb maybe on this one. And inconclusive might have a little bit of both, or point to difficulties in the task. And we ended up with these criteria. We tried a few different sets of definitions, but we thought, okay, well, if there is an incentive and a bias towards something, what might it be? And if you're looking for impact and you're looking for citations, you're probably going to want to be saying, okay, well, our animals are really, really smart, so you should find them interesting and cite them and talk about this. So we kind of thought this positive category might be where we detect some publication bias if it existed. And there are some examples of the claims we had up there, but in the interest of time, I'm going to skip over them and just move on to our results. So this is what we found. And this graph is a little bit complicated, so I'll talk you through it. On the y-axis, you have the claim. So there's 70 columns essentially in here for all the different papers, or 73 columns for all the different papers. On the x-axis. And on the y-axis is how the coders split them out. So there's 6 icons in each column, which says, okay, well, coder 1 categorizes this claim as negative, and this one as positive, and this one as inconclusive. And what you can see in the bottom left corner is all the papers that we ended up calling negative, where 4 or more of the individuals said this was a negative claim. And in the top right, all the ones which we thought, okay, well, these are really positive claims. These are the ones saying the animals are really, really smart. So the first thing to note is that we get a relatively okay agreement. There are clearly some papers which are really, really positive in what they're saying, clearly some which are quite negative, and quite a few which are pretty in the middle, pretty inconclusive. So from this, well, what can we take? Maybe there's a bit of publication bias. It does look like there are many more positive claims than negative claims, but there are a lot of inconclusive claims. So maybe it's not so easy to reduce things down into just confirming or disconfirming hypotheses. We actually find a lot of the time people were sort of hedging in the middle. So who knows what this means for publication bias. Interestingly, we found some inter-individual differences in how coders were doing things. So you can see there's more blue circles in the positive one. So coder number 1 was more likely to say, yes, this is a positive claim, than say coder number 6, who was more biased towards negative. So there might be differences in how people are interpreting the claims and potential biases in papers that we should be aware of. We also did plot the p-value distribution of this, and that gave you the kind of familiar pattern that if we did force it to go to, well, are we getting many more significant results and non-significant results? We were, but actually, did this match up to overwhelmingly positive results? Maybe not. So maybe there were some positive results that were not necessarily attached to really positive and really biased claims. So in our field, it seems like negative results have been possible to be published. We did see some of them. It was about 20%, 15 to 20%. But nevertheless, there is likely still some publication bias, and you can see this at the level of the statistical result as well. I do want to say that some of the methods that people have used to detect publication bias, particularly just counting out whether the hypothesis was confirmed or disconfirmed, might not have great validity. And actually, if we do want to try and pinpoint the effects of publication bias, we do really need to narrow down onto individual research results. It shouldn't matter if just because one person's made a claim about crows being clever, it doesn't necessarily impact the validity of a claim about cuttlefish being clever or something like that. So there are problems with the study of publication bias. And I hope I've not gone over time. I didn't have a timer on, but thank you for listening.